we are looking for adequate reason to believe that Sinai is a real historical event, not just a myth.
For centuries, Jewish apologists have argued that the national revelation at Mount Sinai cannot be false. In this video, we will be responding to one version of such apologetics presented by Rabbi David Gottlieb. Let's begin.
A very common thought is that adequate reason means proof. And proof means absolute infallibility. And I recommended that that's not the right standard. We should not be asking for a proof. We should be asking for adequate reason, and adequate reason means if you consider all the available evidence, and this option is supported better than the others, then this is the one that should be selected.
We have no dispute here. We aren't looking for proof, but we are looking for adequate evidence. This begins by collecting data, forming hypotheses, and choosing the best hypothesis as a theory.
The question is, who are the witnesses, or what is the source of information that delivers Sinai? The type of source of information is this. Nations have traditions about their own past. Sometimes the tradition describes something that happened to the nation in the past, where what it describes is an experience. Something happened to the nation as a whole. Every man, woman, and child in the nation experienced it. So, for example, the tradition says there was a war. If it describes being defeated in the war, in ancient times especially, that meant everybody knew about it because defeat meant the victorious army invaded and burned down the houses and raped the women and looted the coffers and set up taxes for the future time. Everybody knew about it because each person in the group experienced it directly. When you have a national tradition like that, the question is, how reliable are traditions like that? Each tradition is a source of information. It's the category of such traditions that I'm considering. I call these NETs, National Experiential Traditions. That means a national tradition that describes a national experience. And I want to know how reliable traditions like that are. I'm talking about worldwide cultures. I'm talking about throughout the history that we have recorded. I'm talking about the reliability of this particular type of tradition. And I tell you, on the basis of my historical research, there isn't a single example of a national experiential tradition that we know is false. Not one.
Rabbi Gottlieb is partially right and partially wrong. Yes, it is true that behind every national experience tradition stands a generally accurate historical core, but it's not true that every detail of the tradition is necessarily accurate. People don't always remember every detail of the experience, and many times information is lost. Depending on how far away the tradition is from the first written text, many details can change. For example, the historian Benny Morris tells us about his lapse of memory after fighting in a war.
Somebody interviewed me in 1983 after the Israeli invasion of Lebanon and the siege of Beirut, which I participated in as a soldier. And I couldn't remember the sequence of events. What happened? Was Bashar Jamal first assassinated, or did Arafat and his PLO fighters leave on boats before that or after that? I just couldn't remember the sequence. And this is a few months later. And I'm talking about an historian. What I'm saying is that you cannot rely on memory. And certainly you can't rely on people's memories about something which happened 40 years ago, which is still controversial. That is, there's still an ongoing conflict between the people. So they have good reason to remember things in a certain way, or even to lie about what happened in a certain way.
Lucky for Morris, he lives in the age of information, where someone can spend just 30 seconds of internet searching and find enough information to set the record straight. However, this wasn't the case 3,000 years ago. The internet didn't exist, and access to books and even education were extremely rare and expensive. Only a few priests had the means to record and teach such historical facts for the public. Depending on how the experience was transmitted, it is actually quite plausible for many details, even those coming from a national experience, to be false. The Torah's account of the Sinai revelation has been composed very late. According to mainstream scholarship, at least 600 years passed between the first composition of the Sinai tradition and the actual event. Given the fact that most Israelites were polytheists, we should not expect them to value an oral tradition that provides strong evidence for monotheism. Given these factors, one would not be surprised that there are variant traditions and interpretations of what happened. For instance, the Maimonides writes in the Guide to the Perplexed that only Moses heard God's words, but the Israelites only heard incoherent noise. The Zerah Kadesh reports an opinion from Reb Mendel of Rimanov that the Israelites only heard the sound of the letter Aleph being pronounced. There is a Talmudic text that states they only heard the first two of the 10 Commandments from God directly. The Kuzari states that they heard all of the 10 Commandments. Another account in the Talmud says their souls left their bodies as they heard God speak, bringing into question what exactly they remembered as they were dying and resurrected. Even if one ignores all these rabbinic traditions, the Torah text itself seems to portray conflicting narratives to what was happened. In Deuteronomy chapter 5 verse 5, Moses says he acted as a mediator between the people and God, and told them the 10 Commandments. Modern scholarship has divided the text into 4 sources, with conflicting narrative types and details. One should also see Psalm chapter 68, where the revelation at Sinai happens right before God goes out to battle the mountain of Bashan. Given the conflicting reports and the late dates for these documents, we should expect that information was forgotten regarding some details.
Well, the revelation at Sinai was delivered by such a tradition. Our tradition has had the revelation at Sinai as a mainstream, a universal belief for thousands of years. And if you look into the Torah itself, it says that every man, woman, and child heard God speak.
This is inaccurate. As we have just demonstrated earlier, there is great dispute who heard what at Mount Sinai.
So the tradition is a tradition of our nation, and it's a tradition about our ancestors, and it's a tradition about our ancestors having an experience, and the kind of experience you would expect people to remember.
Why would we expect a polytheistic society to remember a monotheistic revelation?
That means it fits into the category of national experiential traditions, and therefore the experience of all mankind with traditions like that gives me positive evidence that our tradition is correct. What are you telling me, Rabbi? You're telling me you got this tradition and it couldn't be wrong? I can think of a dozen ways in which traditions like that could go wrong. There's something called myth formation. You have a group of people and something happens. Now this something might be surprising to them, unanticipated by them, unexplainable by them, let's say a tsunami.
Or let's say a volcanic eruption.
They've never seen anything like this before, they've never heard of something like this before. The sea rises up to 100 feet and smashes into the shore. It makes an impression. Of course, they tell the children, tell their grandchildren, the story gets repeated. Now, the story gets repeated over time. Second generation, third generation, fourth generation. Do they tell the story with extreme accuracy? Do they repeat every detail in the same way every time? No. People's minds drift and they perhaps extrapolate a little bit and maybe add some embellishments to the story. Imagine it's going on for hundreds of years. The story can evolve and change considerably. It's easy to imagine that the story changes from the story of a natural event into the story of a supernatural event. And additions get added. Why did the water strike the shore? Because we have a lousy society, because we did something to anger the gods.
Why did the mountain erupt in fire? Obviously because a god was revealing himself to his people.
3 generations later, and when it smashed into the shore, it said, evil, 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 to convince us that we were evil.
And when the fire came down, it said, I am Yahweh your God.
And then 3 generations after that, it came with more information. You can imagine the story changing and growing and developing this way. Once you understand that myth formation is a process that takes place, and I agree it takes place. Everyone agrees that it does take place. So you can easily imagine it taking place in a case like this. Why do you think that your tradition couldn't be wrong? My answer is, of course it could be wrong. And of course it's easy to imagine that it's wrong. The fact that it could be wrong, the fact that you can imagine that it's wrong, just means that it's possibly wrong. I gave that away. To have any traction against us, the critic has to show not that it's possible wrong, but that it's probably wrong.
We already provided the evidence, namely the fact that most of Israelite culture was polytheistic. The fact that oral history is more prone to error, and the fact that there are disputes demonstrate the probability of myth formation over impeccable hearsay.
What evidence do you have that it's probable? You can't just say that it's probable. You need some evidence to show that it's probable, more than just possible.
Occam's razor tells us to pick the hypothesis with the least assumptions. Myth formation and volcanoes are known to be real, but miraculous revelations are not. So why are you multiplying entities beyond necessity? Just follow the hypothesis that doesn't have the extra assumption.
The very least that he needs is to show that his scenario works sometimes. So let's ask, can he do that? Can he give us any examples where his scenario has actually produced a false NET?
Yes.
No, he cannot.
Yes, I can.
No, he cannot.
Okay, here comes the Mexica, aka the Aztec national revelation story.
He fled the room shouting, "The Mexica have murdered my daughter and flayed her skin! Take up arms and kill them! Erase their names!" The Mexica gathered their warriors and drew their weapons, but the army of Culhuacan fell upon them, and they shattered before the tide. The Mexica fled to the shores of Lake Texcoco, and the warriors threw their shields into the lake to use as rafts. Men, women, and children climbed aboard, and the people rowed out to the swampy islands in the midst of the lake. And there, hidden among the reeds, they huddled in silence until the danger had passed. As the Mexica crept through the marshes, they encountered a spot of dazzling whiteness. The cypress trees, reeds, rushes, and even the frogs and snakes were a brilliant white. As they looked around in awe at such beauty, they came across a nopal cactus, which had grown at the spot where the sorcerer's heart had landed long ago. And upon it was Huitzilopochtli, in the form of a white eagle eating a snake. When the Mexicans approached, he bowed and said, "My children, this is the place. This is Tenochtitlan." They had found their home. The people wept with joy and prostrated themselves on the ground, blessed to find their homeland at last, thanking their patron god, Huitzilopochtli, who had shown them the way.
As we see, they too have a national revelation. Rabbi Gottlieb is well aware of this, and guess what? He argues that the Aztec tradition cannot be considered an NET because it is written centuries later, and because there are variant versions of the story. And there is good reason to believe the Aztecs would not remember it. However, those same problems apply to the Sinai revelation just as well. As Christopher Hitchens would say,
"Well, if the kippah fits, why don't you just wear it?"